Welcome back. So now we are going to extract or export blocks into Excel, but this time only the blocks without attributes. So from our AutoCAD, we will export to Excel using with these columns, the coordinates, both the insertion point X and Y, the block name, the layer, and the rotation. So our flowchart has some slight change here, which means that we select all the block objects. If there is a block, then continue with the process. Otherwise, just display the message and exit the program. So when we are looping through the block, we have to validate that it is not an anonymous block. Otherwise, we just continue looping. We just basically ignore it. So, but however, if it's a regular type of block, then we extract the properties into spreadsheet where we have all these insertion point X, Y, the block name, the layer, and the rotation. And we continue with the process. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to do the coding for exporting of blocks. I see you there. Now that we have a good understanding of the properties that we're going to extract from the block objects, we can now create a method to extract those properties to Excel spreadsheet. So let's get started with building the function first, or the method. So from our export Excel util class, we can create here a public function. Let's just call this as export all blocks, and we return a string, which is the result of the extraction. So first we have to gather all the blocks. The blocks that we're going to export this time are those blocks that doesn't have any attribute. Okay, so now let's have a variable called SS as selection set, and this selection set will be also declaring an instance of the common util object. So we call that as CU, as new common util. This one here. Okay, so now we can store the blocks in a selection set variable that will be coming from the CU get objects, and this time we are going to pass an insert string, which means that we are going to just gather all the blocks, and from this selection set, if it has nothing, then we'll just say return no block found in the drawing, and that's it. We exit the program. However, if there are some blocks that is found in the drawing, then we can continue. So let's create a variable called result as a string and just initialize it to an empty string. Now we create a try catch block. So in the catch block, we're just saying here we encountered an error, or error encountered, and then we will just concatenate basically the message, the exception message or the error message. Okay, but if everything goes well, we will be doing it in the try catch block. And now the first thing that we need to do is connect to Excel and get a worksheet. So we can do this by creating a WS variable for the new Excel.worksheet. Then we will get the value that is coming from this method here, get Excel worksheet, and then we just call that worksheet as blocks. Okay, and the next thing that we should do is to create the column headers. Create column headers. So we can do that by creating a range object, an Excel range object, and now we can populate the specific range. So the range for the first column will be A1, and then the value of that range would be insertion point X. This is the X coordinate of the block insertion point. Then we can just copy this over multiple times because we will be extracting 5 properties. And the second one will be B1. This is the second column. First row, second column. And this time we're going to insertion point Y. And the third one is the third column, which is the block name. We just call that as block name. And the fourth column will be the layer. And finally, the fifth column will be the rotation angle. So at least once we insert it, we know that it's inclining at a certain angle, if there is an inclination there. So next, we have to loop through the selection set and then extract the blocks properties one at a time. To do that, we need a document object. So dim doc as document equals application.document manager, and we will be dealing with the active document. And also we need a variable that will provide us the row number. So let's call that as row num as integer, and we can initialize it to 2, which means that we will be starting from the second row. So now we can loop through the blocks selection set. So we are going to use the transaction, using trans as transaction equals doc dot transaction manager that start transaction. Okay, and now we can do the for each loop. So for each selected object, we call that SOBJ as selected object in selection set, the one that we have created here. So now we can cast the object into a block object, whatever this OBJ is. So it is a block object. So we have to make sure that we are casting it properly. So dim blk as it should be a block reference equals, we'll do a try cast. So that will be the trans that get object, and that is the SOBJ, the selected object, that object ID, and that will be the open mode for read, and that should be cast into a block reference. All right. So now that we have the object, the block object, we can just easily now populate our spreadsheet with the properties that we need. So we have to get the exact range for each of the data that we are going to populate. So starting from the A column, and we just have to concatenate it with the row num. So basically it starts from 2, which means that A2 in our Excel, that value equals, that will be the BLK that position, the insertion point is position that X, and then we can just copy this over multiple times, 5 times actually, just to to be consistent with the headers that we have here. So the second one will be B. This is the second column, and this is the third column. This is the fourth, and this will be the fifth column, which is the rotation. So for the second column, second row will be Y. That is the insertion point Y. And the third one here, that will be the block name, which is just blk.name. And the fourth one here, this is just the layer, so blk.layer. And finally, the rotation, this is just the rotation. And that's it. So now all we have to do is make sure that we increment the row num plus equals to 1, which means that every iteration we have to increment the value of row so that it will go to the third row, fourth row, and so on until all the objects from the selection set has been processed. And all we have to do now is create a result, which means that we send a message to the user that the extraction was completed successfully. So successfully extracted all blocks to Excel. And we return the result at the bottom here. Return result. Right, and that is our completed code for exporting all the blocks. But there is one thing that I have to add here, because we mentioned that the blocks will only be extracted that don't have any attributes. So in this case, now that we have a handle of the block object, we have to make sure that we validate this. So if blk dot attribute collection that count equals 0, which means that they don't have attribute, so that is valid. And another thing is, and it's not blk dot name that contains an asterisk. So we are also excluding those anonymous blocks. We don't need those. We don't need to extract those. And that's it. So all we have to do now is move this over inside the if condition, so that it will only extract all those blocks that doesn't have attributes, and at the same time not anonymous blocks. And that is our completed code. So in the next video, we're going to call this method from the user interface, and then we will test our program. Okay, so I'll see you there. All right, so let us continue building our export blocks method. Before we go to the UI, let me just do one single correction here. The increment of row num should be inside the if code block. The purpose is that only when there is a valid block that we're going to extract, then we have to increment the row. Otherwise, it will just keep on incrementing regardless of whether it's valid or not. So that is not what we are expecting to do. So it will only be incremented when there is a valid data that's been extracted into Excel. So our method should be working all perfectly good now. Next, we have to just create a control from our user interface. So in this case, let's just have here one group container, and let me just call this as, just provide some label there to say export block to Excel functions. And now we can just copy one of these button here and paste it here. We call this as export all blocks. Let's do some changes on the name. We call that btn export blocks. And let's just change the back color to yellow and 4 color to black. There you go. So now if we double click on our button here, it will give us the btn export blocks click method or click event handler. Now we can just copy this line of codes here, and then instead of calling the export polylines method, we can now call the export all blocks method. And that's it. So now we can save our plugin and do a rebuild. Okay, one succeeded. So now let's open up AutoCAD. Okay, and now we can load our plugin. Net load. This is our plugin. Click on always load. Alright, just before we execute the plugin or the export blocks method, let's just have a quick look on the blocks in this drawing. So by selecting, let's say BLKS, as is get, I'm just using AutoLisp here to gather all the blocks. This is the same filter that we pass on into our code, the insert. So list, how many BLKS or blocks do we have? We have 171. 3 were not in the current space. So some of these, if we list one of these, this is a anonymous block, and we are excluding all those types of blocks. We will only export those blocks that are not anonymous and at the same time do not have any attribute. So this one here, the door French, this one has attributes, so this will be excluded. Alright, so now let's execute our export all blocks method. We should see now the Excel spreadsheet here, and the message says successfully extracted all blocks to Excel. Let's examine our Excel file. Look at that. We have the insertion point X and Y, and we have the block name, we have the layer, and we have the rotation angle. And none of these have the anonymous blocks, which means that these are all the block names that we have extracted without attribute and are not anonymous blocks. We have the sink, toilet, range oven, bathtub, and lighting fixture. And now we can just save this into a folder that we want. Can just put it into the temp folder and call this as blocks. Save it. Okay, and that's it for our export all blocks function. In the next video, we're going to export a specific block with attribute. I'll see you there.